first talk about a couple of things which I think are relevant. So this is a picture which is, there are many variants of this picture. Essentially, there are a number of phases of these projects, but on the right hand side, on the right side of the vertical line is the essentially implementation executions phase where concrete is poured into the ground or whatever, right? Any project is built. Prior to that, there are all kinds of planning decisions that are taken to get to a point where you can actually go to somebody and say, you know, put pipes in the ground or put concrete in the ground. And so you can essentially divide these two into a planning phase or a front end of the project, which goes from time t equals 0 when you first thought about the project to the point where you're actually ready to build. And the back end of the project, which is you actually build the project and start using it. Generally what happens is people are very eager to get to the back end, right? Because you want to get it done. You want to get the road built, you want to get the power plant built, you want to get people to start using that infrastructure. And because of that, and then of course you want to do that, that's where your returns are, that's where the value is created, that's where the political capital is created, that's where people can sort of brag and say, look, I built this versus that. And so what tends to happen is that first part, that planning part, tends to shrink, you know, quite a bit, right? To the point where in certain cases you have, you know, insanely short durations for planning, where you go to somebody and say, you know what, I want to start constructing this in a period of 3 months. So figure out, you know, how this road has to be built so that I can actually award a tender to a contractor so that they can build this road from city A to city B in 3 months. And I want to do it in 3 months because, you know, then I can actually make a public announcement. It will take 18 months for the road to get built, a few more months for people to use it. And before my election term finishes, people might actually be able to see the benefits of what I'm doing, right? So generally that phase tends to get shrunk, and it looks like it's a relatively simple phase. I mean, it's all on paper, right? So what's there? All you need to do is plan a road, take out a map, figure out you know, how you want this road to go, and you know, just figure out the specifications, right? There's enough specifications on you know, the thickness of various layers, etc. Just award the contract, right? It sounds quite simple, but it turns out that that phase is actually one of the most critical phases of the project. Right? There are a lot of complications and challenges that you should either manage in that phase, or if you do not manage in that phase, then those challenges are likely to manifest later on, and we'll talk about some of them going forward. This particular picture I took from this book called The Strategic Management of Large Engineering Projects by Roger Miller, who is a faculty in Canada, and Don Lessard, who is an emeritus faculty at MIT. And they sort of say sometimes that in certain cases, if it takes X units of time to do the construction, right, then perhaps it should take 10x units of time to do the planning, right? So planning should really outpace construction by 10x, because that's how important planning is, right? So let's take a look under the hood. The other part of this picture is that what it also tells you is that in the planning phase, right, you spend very little money compared to what you will spend overall. You spend most of your money in construction, right? Yet in the planning phase, you have the complete flexibility to do whatever changes you want, right? So the planning phase is the phase where you can really get things right. You're not spending money, everything's on paper, right? You can change specifications. As you start moving from the left side of the picture to the right, you're starting to spend more money, right? Your budgets are decreasing, right? That's the bottom curve that's going up. And your ability to make decisions is coming down, right? If I've already sort of started pouring concrete in the ground, and suddenly I say, or if I started pouring asphalt and I suddenly say, look, I want this to be done differently. I want to use a different material. I want to widen this road. So I want you to, that might involve taking out all the stormwater drains at the side of the road and relocating them because you want to widen the road. So it starts becoming more and more expensive, right? So the control you have on your project diminishes as you go through, to a point where you know, you get to 3/4 of the way into the project where there's very little you can do. You've got relatively little amount of money available in your budget, and you've already put so much in the ground that you can't really change things too much. At that point, if you realize that what you built was not exactly what was expected, it's a bit too late, right? So that's why the planning phase is important. So take a little bit of a look under the hood, right? So this is more or less, I think, what Likita was talking about. There's a preliminary feasibility stage, right? Detailed projects, contracting service. Another way of looking at the same thing is sort of this sort of picture, very similar. There's an initial stage where you identify a project. Now, identifying a project is also not easy, right? There's a lot of sort of discussions on what is the right kind of project here. So for instance, in Chennai itself, when we started looking at, you know, traffic is a problem, what should we do? Multiple options emerge, right? Metro rail, monorail, better bus systems. Start taxing automobiles so that people actually reduce the number of cars that they have on the road, like Singapore, for instance, right? So you can't really, it's very expensive to buy cars, right? So all kinds of ideas come through in terms of resolving that problem. So to pick a project from that, to identify a project is not a simple task, right? Part of it is based on technology, part of it is based on economics, part of it is based on politics, right? So one of the reasons metro rails might be appetizing is that they're large pieces of infrastructure that somebody can claim to have built. It's not quite as sexy as just putting in new buses and reorganizing your bus system, right? What's the challenge in that, right? Whereas building a metro rail is. So identifying projects sometimes take time, right? You've got to consult with stakeholders. So I have a power deficit, I want to put up a power plant, okay? What do people who are going to live next to that power plant have to say? Particularly, for instance, if you're planning to use nuclear power, right? Or even if you're going to build a thermal power plant, right? I have a water treatment problem, so I want to build a sewage treatment plant. Okay, what about the people who are going to live close to the sewage treatment plant? What do they have to say, right? So I think all of these things are things that we need to think about, right? And if you don't think about these issues, then essentially what will happen is you will go ahead, right? You'll award the project to somebody, and then as the project is being constructed, you'll have all kinds of protests, right? You'll have people blocking the project, you'll have people turning away lorries, you'll have people staging demonstrations, right? Opposition political parties might think they might get good political mileage out of it, they might start escalating the issue, and you might then be faced with issues that you find that then become very expensive to handle and which delay your project in an indeterminate fashion, right? So some of you have been following, the Sterlite saga today. That's a key case of stakeholders, right, coming in and protesting against essentially a mining operation. And there are many other examples that we can give of where stakeholders have not really been taken into consideration. We don't even understand who the stakeholders are, and these people then come out and protest. So the best place to identify stakeholders is right at the beginning, right? What do people think about this project, right? And we'll talk about stakeholder management a little bit later in this course, right? So that's a difficult stage in itself. Then you get to the stage where you say, okay, I think I've identified the project, I think this will work, right? So this kind of a power plant can be located here, not too many people are going to be affected, it's going to generate enough power, and I think I can distribute it to this area. All of that works. You've got to start getting a little bit more detail, right? You've got to start looking at, okay, now if I'm going to build this power plant, what specific technology am I going to choose, right? Even if it's a thermal power plant, is it going to be naphtha, is it going to be coal, right? Where am I going to situate it, right? Is that land available? Who's going to give that land to me? How much is it going to cost, right? So you start getting a little bit more detail until you actually start getting into documentation. Somebody actually comes up with a drawing. Based on that drawing, you decide how much this is going to cost, right? Then you have to start thinking about, if it's going to cost X, do I have the money? Okay, if I don't have the money, who will I go to get the money, right? And this is where the discussion came on a variety of people that you can get money from. Should I do it as government, right? Should I give it to a private contractor and do it through PPP? Right? If I give it as a private to a private contractor to do it, to a private concessionaire to do through PPP, how will that person make his money? Right? If they are going to make money through some toll, then what is the likely return on investment that they are going to make? Will it be high enough that they would be interested in coming? Will it be so high that we are taking society's earnings and giving it to a private organization? Right? What kind of contract should I have? Should it be a fixed price contract? Should it be a cost plus contract? Right? Should it be a build, operate, transfer contract? Right? How am I going to operate and make? And all of this now needs to be documented before you can actually go and select a contractor and say, boss, go ahead and build this for me. Right? So there are lots of things that need to be done, and these things are not very simple, right? Because these things take a long period of time. Sometimes you have election cycles, new governments come in, lot of alternatives to think about, new technologies come in, right? So we say water scarcity in Tamil Nadu, so we say let's think desalination. Okay, great, desalination, but where do we desalinate? Okay, if I desalinate too close to the city, am I affecting people? If I desalinate too far from the city, am I paying too much to transport the water back in the city? Right, what kind of desalination technology should I use? Should I bring in the private sector, should I not? And while I'm having all of these discussions, multiple things will happen. New desalination technologies will come up, right? And I have to go back to the drawing board and see, will this new membrane that somebody in the Middle East has invented, right, be better suited for the kind of water quality I have off the coast of Tamil Nadu, right? Economic fluctuations will happen. Somebody might have said, I'll lend you money at 13% interest. That will now become 17% interest or 15% interest or whatever, because markets have changed, right? SEBI or RBI has put in new policies right, that people now need to adhere to, right? So it's a little bit of an iterative procedure. It's a moving target. Okay, I think I have something that works. Oh, but by the way, that interest rate is no longer available, right? So now if I have to borrow at this interest rate, it's a bit too expensive. So maybe I can't build 100 MLD, million liters a day treatment plant. Maybe I have to start bringing it down, right? How low can I bring it to make it feasible? So not only is it involved, it's also iterative. All right. So this, you guys can read all of this, but this is another way of looking at it, right? So first you sort of initiate and explore, right? Is this project even feasible? And an option might be just sort of exit, right? At each stage there's an exit option. You might say it doesn't really work. If you think it works, now can somebody come up with a proposal, right? Which actually tells me a little bit about what technology we're going to use, where we're going to do this, how many people are going to benefit, all of that. Then you actually start negotiating, and sometimes those negotiations might even be within government, right? So within government you might have to sort of say, go to the finance department and say, do we have enough money to build this? And they may say yes, they may say no, right? If they say no, then will they allow you to borrow from elsewhere? Sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes the answer is no, right? Who should build it? Now opposition parties in parliament might say, look, this is not the project that you should build. So there's a lot of negotiation, political negotiation that happens before these projects even see the light of day. Then you actually start having people come out and say, look, I know you guys sat somewhere in parliament and agreed that this power plant should be built, right? But what kind of impact is this going to have on my lives, right? Am I going to live in a completely polluted neighborhood? Right? Will land prices suddenly rise because infrastructure is being built and I can no longer afford to pay rent? Right? Will it become too crowded because everyone is going to start coming in and working here and living? What are the implications, right? And is that something that, are you going to resettle me, right? Because I'm living in a slum. If so, where will I go? What kind of work will I do? All of these are fears that will emerge and need to be confronted. You've got to pacify all kinds of strategies. We'll talk about them a little bit later in the class before you can get to a closure on paper, right? Not even a molecule of concrete has gone in the ground yet, right? So the project preparation phase is sometimes something that can make or break a project. There are enough examples of projects where you just run through, somebody says, look, as government, I can award a contract, I'll award a contract tomorrow, go ahead, right? And then you have all kinds of protests, right? And we can recall some really key sort of famous ones, right? The Narmada Bachao Andolan, right, is essentially a group that came out against infrastructure, related to the dam on the river Narmada, right? Essentially because they felt, look, government is going too fast in terms of building this, and there are issues with building a dam, right? Nearby places are going to get, people are going to get displaced because there's going to be localized flooding, ecosystems are going to be destroyed, and is it worth building a dam just so that you can provide hydropower or irrigation or whatever it is, right? So lots of cases where these kinds of agencies come and sometimes completely stop projects, right? There are enough instances of projects. An example from several years ago is Tata Motors tried to build something in West Bengal, right? And because the stakeholder landscape was not understood well enough, the project was stopped. And we look at a number of cases later in the class. So again, if we go through the life cycle of a project, you go through all of this, right? All of these are negotiations and deliberations, right? So then you get serious and you say, okay, now, we've agreed to this project. Of course, some people will always be unhappy, but that's fine, right? You can't keep everyone happy, but majority, we agree that this is a good project, needs to be done. And for whatever reason, we agree that, well, let's just say we'll do it within government. All right. So now you've got to go ahead and raise financing for it, right? Now there are a number of places, places from where you can look for financing. Okay. Simply go to banks, like financial institutions, lending institutions. They're supposed, and some of them have been set up to lend for infrastructure, right? So if you look at some of these names like IDBI, Infrastructure Development Bank of India, right? It's very clear. They want to sort of invest in infrastructure projects, right? So you go to places like IDBI and you say, can you give me a loan? That's one option. On the private side, a private player can say, so a loan has to be repaid, but equity is essentially a share in the project. If the project does well, you sell a lot of power, you make a lot of revenue on tolls, then those profits are distributed to your shareholders. So you can go to somebody and say, give me equity instead, right? So I'll give you shares in return. I won't promise to repay you, right? But as the project does well and the project's balance sheet is better and better, you get equity. So there's equity, there's debt. Now debt against comes from various places. We've talked about banks. Okay. Another category is not the commercial banks, but the multilateral banks like the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, right? Why go to the multilaterals? The multilaterals essentially say, look, I'm not a commercial bank trying to make a profit. All right. I am here for development. Okay, so I want to do it responsibly, right? I don't want to give free money because free money doesn't have value, right? I want to give you guys money, but at a reasonable interest rate. I'm not interested in 13%, 15% interest rates, right? I'm interested in 8%, whatever. So I'll give it to you at a very developmental rate, okay? Because I'm interested in development, as long as your project is developmental in nature, right? So there's a trade-off there. On the one hand, you can get possibly more reasonable loans, but on the other hand, your reporting requirements might be more stringent. Right, so the World Bank, for instance, will insist. I mean, you've got to prove that it's developmental. You've got to prove that you've resettled people in a responsible manner. You've got to prove that you've acquired land in a responsible manner. So all of those sort of considerations are there. So that's another group. Yet another group are our export credit agencies. Right, what does an export credit agency do? An export credit agency essentially is looking at increasing the exports of a certain country. So if I were JICA, or what used to be called JBIC, which is Japan's export credit agency, I want to increase exports from Japan. So how do I do that? I go to, say, India, I go to the metro rail, and I tell these guys, look, I'll give you money for your metro rail project at very low rates, right? Possibly even a couple of %, right? Soft loans. Okay, so your eyes light up, right? Amazing, come on, IDBI was telling me 11%, 12%, World Bank was telling me 8%, and that looked good, and you're telling me like 2%, 3%. It's too good to be true, right? What's the catch? They say there's no catch, except when you guys go through the process of building the project, then I'd like certain Japanese contractors to be involved in the project, right? I'd like you to buy some of our coaches or transmission equipment, etc., from Japan, right? So essentially, I'll give you money, you can build the project, but make sure that some of our fellows are involved in this process, right? So that's essentially what an export credit agency tries to do, right? So again, from the developing countries' perspective, interest rates are low, right? But you have to, in many cases, use some of the assets of the country from which the export credit agency is representing from. But possibly, if it's Japan has pretty good contractors like Shimizu, all of these guys are top, Kumagai, Obayashi, these are top construction firms world over. And they probably have really good signaling systems, etc. So maybe, it's not like you're getting something cheap, right? Maybe you are getting something that's good quality. And so in those cases, export credit agencies make sense. So the point is, you have a choice. All of these people are out there asking for money. There are trade-offs. Okay, you decide which ones you want. Now, sometimes if you don't make a well thought out decision, right? And when you say, I want 10,000 crores, those guys are not going to write you a 10,000 crore check at the beginning of the project, right? Money will come in over a period of time. There'll be some kind of schedule of when you can draw money. Now, obviously, you want to sort of talk to people who will sustain an interest over the course of that project. What could happen in certain projects is, because you've picked some kind of a new financial institution which is not very stable, and somewhere in the middle of the project they actually go under, right? So they sort of go bankrupt or whatever. That's one reason why money might disappear. Or you go in with somebody like the World Bank, and the World Bank says you've got to do these kinds of things, land acquisition, resettlement, etc. But they take a call midway saying, you promised to do all of this, but you've not paid these people a fair compensation, right? You've not resettled these people in the manner that you were supposed to resettle them, right? And therefore, I'm withdrawing support. So all of these cases where people can start withdrawing support, which is why it's important for you to have done enough work in the planning phase, right? So then you get to a point where, you say, okay, now it's worth really getting serious. You go to a consultant, you pay them money, they come up with detailed drawings, including reinforcement, etc. Okay, so that's interesting. So the question is, do we actually have them, number one, at a subnational level? And would you then, and the other sort of corollary is, could they even be private, right? Why would they? I have to tell you, I'm intrigued by the idea, but I am not sure that I have come across subnational export credit agencies, apart from generally ministries doing that kind of evangelization work. So, someone in Tamil Nadu essentially saying, look, we can export this to, we've got surplus power, right? So why don't you buy power from us, kind of dealing. But it's intriguing. And this is something that's probably worth looking at. There's a term paper at the end of the class, and this could be potentially the kind of topic you might want to investigate. So I don't know the answer to that question, but the ones I've come across have been national organizations. So they don't necessarily take an amount from the company. So the way it works is essentially what they're doing is, money is going out of a country, it's coming back in, right? Because it's going to you and you're paying and it's coming back in, and these guys are probably making some profit because they would have bid with some kind of a profit. So essentially what is happening is the country is growing, right? So the GDP of the country is growing, etc. And therefore, to strategically do that, the government will pump money into the export credit agency, right? So that essentially is the nature of how this works. So it isn't as if they charge, JICA will, for instance, I don't think they charge a Shimizu or an Obayashi a fee for doing this and allowing them to participate, because ultimately even that will be done somewhat competitively. So most of the ones that I've looked at have been have had some link with government, because essentially it's the country's way of promoting exports, right, from that country. Okay, so we also have one. We have something called the Export Import Bank, Exim Bank, etc., which we also use. Okay, all right. So so we go through this entire protracted phase of planning. Then you actually go ahead and select a contractor. Okay, and there are decisions to be made there as well. Private, do we just do it, and should I just get a contractor to build it, and I'll pay him at the end of it, or should I do it PPP? Should I get somebody who can bring in the finances, they will build it, I'll allow them to operate, what do I do? If I do the PPP route, then there are all kinds of choices. How long should I let them operate? So all of these and this is where the transaction advisor comes in. The transaction advisor, a PwC or an Ernst & Young, and by the way, many people who have taken this class have been recruited by these people. In fact, just before I came in, one of our alumnus who's now with Ernst & Young came in because he's trying to do a transaction in Chennai. So essentially government calls these guys and say, look, I want to get this project done. Okay, I know that I need this project. Initially we've got approvals, all of that kind of stuff. Now I want a public-private partnership to be done. You tell me how. Okay, so I want you to figure out what should be the contractual form, what kind of tolls should this guy charge, all of that kind of stuff, right? So you figure this thing out. So that consultant then comes in, they develop a preliminary financial model so that they can understand how much toll can this person charge to be profitable. Then they go ahead and start calling for bids. Bids come in, how do you even evaluate these bids? What do you look at? So all of that these transaction advisors take care of. And at the end of it, you've got a winner, right? You've got an agency that's either going to do the construction or an agency that's going to do the construction and the operation. Okay, and then they actually start operating the project, and in between you have all kinds of NGOs that might come in, and some of them might come in ahead of time, some of them come in later. The concessionaire or even the project sponsor has the option of buying insurance. There is a particular kind of insurance that used to be very popular called political risk insurance. Right? Political risk insurance is very popular because you never knew. I mean, suddenly a country might suddenly switch around because a government changed, and they might suddenly decide to yank the concession from under your feet, saying, look, that was the old corrupt government that gave you that ability to develop that power plant, goes against the constitution and the prosperity of the entire country, out you go. Okay, so these are risks that you have to deal with. So how do you deal with that risk? I mean, of course you can negotiate, etc., and you can do all kinds of things, but perhaps buying insurances is one of these one of these sort of strategies. Of course, today it becomes difficult to do because countries also have reputations, right? So if you do that once or twice, no investment, no one's going to come into your country, and obviously that's difficult as well because we are a very globally interconnected world. So perhaps that risk is reducing globally, but it is there. The most creative way of handling that risk was exemplified by one of these Norwegian companies. I think it was a company called Det Norske Veritas that sort of built power plants. So what these guys used to do is they used to build a power plant that sat on a ship or a barge, right? So they'd build it in Norway, and it would sort of sail round to Dhaka, whatever, right? And they would essentially, the power plant would be on the barge, and they'd essentially connect it to the city. Right, so it was a very mobile power plant, if you will, right? So you think of most of these infrastructure assets as being immobile, right? I can't take a road with me, I can't take a power plant with me, but these guys figured out a way to take the power plant with them. So now, if I have an agreement with the government of Bangladesh saying you'll pay me for power, okay, and a new government comes in and they say, sorry, right, I can't pay you for power anymore. It's very simple. I just yank the plug and sail away with my barge. Right. Whereas otherwise, I'd be stuck with this, big infrastructure asset in the ground, and there's nothing I can do, right? And technological know-how is easy to reverse engineer, right? So even if I and my technicians leave, I'm sure people can figure out how to operate that power plant. So there was always this risk with infrastructure assets that I'll spend all the money building it, and then what if the government takes it away from me, right? Now there are creative ways of dealing with that. Anyway, so yeah, so I think we've talked about primarily, all of these are just details of various studies and things. There's something called a detailed project report that you see in bullet 2, which is a comprehensive document that really spells out how much will this cost, what will it look like, what are the returns to be made. If you get to DPR, then you're in a position where you can actually start tendering the project, right? So DPR is sort of a milestone. Again, sometimes you take about a month and give a consultant, and we'll look at least one case later in the class on water supply in Mysore, where essentially consultant was given a couple of months and said, come out of the DPR. Right? And so weren't able to really do a really good job on cost benefit analysis, all of that, right? Then once you have a project, you start financial engineering, all of that, start looking at private participation, and make sure that, look, projects to be successful need to be politically feasible, right? People need to get some mileage out of it. It should be acceptable from a political perspective. It should be socially acceptable. Right? Otherwise, citizens are going to protest. These days, if it's not environmentally feasible, short term there are protests from environmental interest groups. Long term, you might cause ecological damage that might come and bite you in the foot. Legally feasible, and this is very important because some projects, for instance, I would love to build a treatment plant here. But as per the zoning regulations, and this might be the optimal place for building the treatment plant because it's the natural place where all the wastewater can be collected. But as per zoning regulations, that might be zoned into a residential neighborhood. And in a residential neighborhood, legally, I may not be able to build 100 million liters a day treatment plant. So legally, my project may not be feasible. Right? There's an example many years ago when our first airport was going to be privatized, and they picked Bangalore, and they did all of this stuff, called in consultants, etc., figured out how a public-private partnership model would work, consulted stakeholders, etc., and then finally they ran into this roadblock where the act that was used to set up the Airports Authority of India clearly said that all airports in India should be owned and operated by the Airports Authority of India. What that means is private participation is not possible as per the act. As per the law of the land, private participation is not possible, right? So that's a legal challenge. So they had to go back and amend that, right, to get to a point where private participation was allowable in the airport sector before you could do this, right? So legally, and you would think that's the first thing that they would check, but sometimes, people have so many things going on that they don't really do that. And clearly it has to be economically, financially feasible, because if somebody doesn't benefit, right, it's not going to get done. So if it turns out that you have a tiny budget, right, and therefore no contractor can hope to make a profit on this project, who's going to come forward, right? No one is going to build this project. And finally, technologically, right, it's great to sort of talk about these large bridges that would connect various parts of the country, expressways, etc., or desalination technologies that can desalinate for 5 rupees a kiloliter. But is the technology available, right? So you have to, and sometimes it's one of these things where if you figure out the answer to one of these, something else will crop up, right? So I can do this economically very cheaply, but in order to do so, I might have to locate it in an area where land is cheap. And by the way, that land is a wetland or a marshland, which is why the land is cheap, right? And therefore, I'm going to cause environmental damage by doing this, right? So people will talk to you about places like Pallikarnai Marsh, where there's a lot of development that's happened, right? So maybe from a cost perspective, it was cheap, but from an environmental perspective, it's costly. So balancing these becomes a big process, right? And that's a big challenge. So legally feasible, so we have, the law of the land, we have the constitution, we have a body of laws, right? So legally feasible essentially is something that should be defensible in front of any court of law, high court, supreme court, whatever. But just because it's legally feasible may not necessarily make it politically feasible, right? A case in point is, again, go back to the whole bus transit system. Is there any legal impediment to us improving our bus transit system and saying that is our strategy to combat traffic? Or is there any legal impediment to me putting a tax tomorrow on automobiles, right? So that every person who owns an automobile will have to pay an extra tax, right? Just like a property tax, I put in a recurring automobile tax, like Singapore has, for instance, right? Legally, there may be nothing preventing me, but politically, right, might be a problem. So we talked about water in the last class, right? I have a public-private partnership project for water. Legally, is there anything preventing me? Nothing at all. But it involves me going and telling people you have to pay per use. You have to pay 100, 200 rupees per kiloliter of water. Politically, that may not be feasible because people might say, look, if I do that, and I can, but I'll get outvoted in the next election. So legally and politically are often two very... No, a particular project on PPP, I have to come up with a tariff. No, a particular water supply project on PPP, if I have a private sector coming in, we have to agree what are you going to be able to charge people so that you can actually make your money, right? So a particular project-based discussion, and he shows me a spreadsheet and says, oh, I have to charge at least 200 rupees a kiloliter for this project to be feasible, or 50 rupees a kiloliter, whatever. Okay. Now, can you mandate that can be charged? Yes, you probably can. There are powers vested in you to change tariffs. Right? But will you do that politically? That will be the end of your political career, right? So politically and legally are two separate things, all right? So then there's this whole bid process management and so on, and yeah, so you guys can read through all of this. I put in a timeline for a ring road project we once did in Chennai, where after all of this was done in February, the government issued an order to proceed. Then there's a process. So they have put advertisements in newspapers. There was a request for proposal document. So even just awarding it is not a simple process. It takes time, right? They arranged for site visits so people could come and see what is the land like, how much pre-construction will I need to do, a couple of site visits. Then there was a pre-bid conference in April. And then, in May, people submitted and so on and so forth. And then, the bids were opened in June after all the bids came in, a decision was made. And then at the time, I didn't put these dates in, but letters were. So it's again, just because you have all of these documents nicely worked out, doesn't necessarily mean that you will have a project that you can award the next day. Even that takes period of time, right? And public-private partnerships take longer. Right, so BO and BOT, we'll talk about a little bit more in a class or two, but BOT, as the name implies, is build, operate, transfer, right? So what that means is I, as a concessionaire, right, who's going to, so a government comes to me and says, I want a road to be built. What I'd like you to do is I want you to bring the money, build the road, right? Why should you build the road? Because I'll let you collect some toll on it. You'll make some profits from the toll, right? But at the end of it, you have to transfer it back to me. In other words, I own it, right? It's almost like I'm leasing it to you. I'm leasing this area to you, 20 years, build, own, build, operate, and then after 20 years, you've got to transfer it to me, right? And even within those 20 years, right, I am the owner, right? Ownership vests in me. You are just sort of my, lease operator or whatever, right? You're taking it from me for a period of time. I've given you certain rights, right? So you can perhaps do something with the road, you can do something with the tolls. You can't, for instance, take that entire stretch of land and build resorts on it, right? So you don't have ownership at all, right? I've given you certain rights, and you can then use those rights, make some money, and you've got to give it back to me. BOO is build, own, operate, right? Essentially there I'm transferring ownership to you, right? And I'm telling you, okay, here's what, you own it now, right? There's no transfer at the end of it. Sometimes there's build, own, operate, transfer, where we say, okay, you can take certain decisions that you could not do under the BOT model, but you still have to transfer it back to me. So from a government's perspective, you've got to think very carefully about whether you want that asset or not, right? So it's very difficult to BOO a road, right? Because a road ultimately is a public asset, right? How could I give ownership of it to a private operator, right? So that is something that I will BOT normally. On the other hand, on the other hand, if I have I'm public sector undertaking that manufactures, cars like Maruti Suzuki kind of equivalent, right? So that I might just want to privatize, right? I might just want to give it to somebody and say you own and operate it. Right? So you have to sort of look at the asset to decide. So it depends. I mean, the point is, in many cases, the asset is not there in the BOO system, right? So I'm asking you to finance it and I'm asking you to build it, right? So you're building the asset. In the BOT, you're building it for me, right? Yes, you can enjoy it for a bit, get some money, give it back. In the BOO, you're building it for yourself, right? So there is no asset that I'm giving you, right? There is essentially, maybe there's some land and maybe you have to buy the land from me, that kind of depends. Or maybe you have to acquire the land yourself and you put it into the project cost, all right? But you are building it for yourself, right? It's build, own, and operate, and there's no transfer necessarily at the end of that project, right? So these are all decisions. You have to think and make these kinds of decisions. So again, the key point of this class is, people say plan, right? You want to build a road? Fine, call a consultant, right? He'll tell you this subgrade layer should be this, you put asphalt like this on the top, etc. Bid it out, right? Any of us can estimate how much it's going to cost. This is what it's going to cost. Get the money, get the project done, right? But there are all of these other things that you've got to think about, and if you don't think about them, right? If you build something that is politically or socially completely incompatible, very soon, and we'll see many examples in this class of water supply in Cochabamba, dams in Uganda, etc., where Cochabamba is in Bolivia, where you will find this kind of dynamic happening. So if you looked at this Tamil Nadu process, if you look at the players, lots of players, right? So there's the government, right? The government has probably called all kinds of consultants to do the design, feasibility, etc. All kinds of consultants involved in different phases. You have management consultants like the McKinseys of the world that might come in right at the beginning to do the larger study on is this even viable. Then you get the PwC, E&Y kind of consultant to do a bit of economic viability. Then you get our hardcore, CH2M Hill, Mott MacDonald, or even an L&T to come in, L&T Ramboll to come in and do the engineering consultancy, right? How should this airport be designed, right? What are the properties of that tarmac layer, right? So different consultants. Then somebody comes and says, I'll take you through the bid process. Then a concessionaire or a contractor comes in, right? So they operate, right? Then there are engineers, there are independent consultants who will monitor for you, all kinds of people. And then you have all these NGOs who are at the periphery, what we call external stakeholders, right? Who are there throughout this process, right? Keeping watch. Right, so it's a very complex picture. So again, infrastructure, people think of it as government awarding a contract to a contractor and get it built, right? How difficult is that? Right, it's far from the truth. There are tons of people who are involved in this, all putting pressure, right? The lender is not just giving you money and walking away, right? They want to really make sure that you give their money back, which means they want you to tell them a little bit about the kind of technology choices that you're making. They want to understand what are you going to do if none of the cars pay toll. What if they all just ram the barrier and go, right? What are you going to do, right? Because finally you won't be able to pay me then. What are the precautions that you're taking? So they're not just sort of sitting back, and they want you to, so they continual reporting. Each of these companies have boards. So there's lots of players putting a lot of pressure in order for these projects to work. And some of them are completely disconnected, right? NGOs are not connected to banks, right? But a bank's decision on lending will be based on, have you managed the potential NGOs there? I mean, otherwise, why am I a fool to give you lend money to you when people are going to rise up in arms any moment? So yeah, so all of these, there's political risk insurance, and you guys mentioned there are many of these kinds of, there are lots of Indian consultants, financiers. This is, by the way, and what these guys put up is only a very partial list, right? It's the tip of the iceberg. Okay, so we'll stop there.